Hey, welcome to Shop Talk with Brandi and James.
We talk about all things related to mental health and cross-cultural workers.
Thanks for joining us, and welcome to Season 3.
Here we go.
Well, welcome back to Shop Talk. We're excited to have Chyrl Mullins here today. She's an educational consultant diagnostician for Wycliffe. She's a teacher, an educator, an educational therapist. And today we're getting together to talk about autism and spectrum and neurodivergent and these words that are now really becoming mainstream. There's TV shows about them and movies, and it's, I think, helpful for us to take a little bit of a deeper dive, in particular because in our organization, we seem to have access and experience of some of these particular things perhaps higher than the norm. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So great to have you here, Chyrl. I'd like to know a little bit about your experience with autism, and that's like a huge, vague question there, but I suppose as we're looking at autism and how it affects individuals and families and children on the field, I just would like to know a little bit about your experience and how you became interested in it and such.
So my son was developing normally, and then all of a sudden had a reset and couldn't read or write anymore, didn't know his friends' names. Took a long time for us to get a diagnosis. We were in the military, and I found NILD, which is the National Institute for Learning Differences, and took training with them, level 1, level 2. I had already been through Orton Gillingham because he was severely dyslexic. And so I put together a curriculum and started working with him. At that time, he was not diagnosed with autism, but we continued plugging along until he was about 16 when he was saying, well, why am I so different? I mean, we'd already gotten past the hurdle with dyslexia. We're working on, helping him be more structured with the ADHD. And he was just like, I'm just different. Why am I different? And I said, would you like to find out? And so I took him to get the diagnosis, which I already knew was autism. And he was ecstatic when he found out he was autistic. And he actually taught me the phrase. This was long enough ago that it wasn't common knowledge, but he said, I am neurodivergent. And it's like, oh, well, that's really a good word for it.
Really? Hold on, I gotta Google this.
I gotta look this up. But yeah, he was ecstatic, and it helped him so much to understand who he was. I have always taught my children that you are created in the image of God. You are perfect. There isn't anything wrong with you. You are not broken. You just think differently for a purpose that God has prepared for you. And so with that, he was just able to say to people, oh, I really want to talk to you, but I don't know how to start a conversation. Will you start it for me and I'll jump in?
Oh, isn't that great? That's so great.
It is good.
It sounds like it was almost a relief for him to be able to just understand himself better and realize this is how my brain processes information. And it just gives him more of a window in how to understand himself and understand how he can relate to other people, like maybe where his strengths are, where his weaknesses are, and how he can do that.
We're kind of throwing around some terms. I realize everyone may not be at the same place we are in terms of talking about autism and spectrum and neurodivergent. So you kind of came into it almost observationally, watching those changes. I'd love for us just to talk a little bit about what that is and what is exactly the spectrum, because we hear that a lot, and then we can kind of keep going from there.
Right. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it has lots of symptoms. It is a spectrum. So you have people on the spectrum. I mean, there's a saying, once you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, because they're all different. My son is very high functioning, obviously. He's very bright. So when you're looking at a diagnosis of autism, there are two main categories. There's the social and communication challenge, and you need 3 of those kind of things, like the reciprocal interaction and conversation. Like, can they do the back and forth? Are they interested in what you're interested in talking about? Or do they always keep going back to one thing, or they monologue, that kind of thing. And they also have trouble with nonverbal communication. That doesn't mean they can't speak. Some of them can't, but nonverbal communication is that body language we use, those things that we use, those gestures and facial expressions, eye contact. Do they make eye contact? Not everybody who doesn't make eye contact is on the spectrum, by the way. A lot of people do that because they're visual thinkers, and so they're staring off in space because they're, visualizing what's going on. But people with autism will often say that it hurts to look someone in the eye. I found that really interesting.
Wait, can you explain that a little bit more?
No, because I'm not autistic. I don't get that.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so yeah, as parents, we'll often say, now look them in the eye, or look at me. And it was Alexander who made me aware that I was trying to teach him to draw, and we were working on people, and I was having him draw eyes, and he's like, it hurts. I'm like, what hurts? So he was young, and it was really interesting that's something. And I've heard other autistic people, students, that clients of mine say, yeah, it really does. It's kind of painful to look someone in the eye. And so we teach other strategies for that. So yeah, so nonverbal communication. Often their face won't express their emotions. They'll be just kind of a blank faced, or they'll have
Flat.
scowl. And so working with them on that, or they might not understand your facial expression, that you're done talking and you're ready to move on. Another thing is relationship management. So they have trouble making friends, keeping friends. They're socially awkward. So those are the 3 social skills and communication. The other things that they need are the repetitive and restricted behavior. They need 2 out of the 4 of that in that group, which is repetitive or unusual movement. This is the stereotypical, like flapping of the hands or circling. It could be other things too, like a speech tick, that they make a verbal expression over and over, or the way they use objects, or maybe it's the picking of their skin, things like that. The other thing is inflexibility. They insist on sameness. I had one client, and I couldn't continue until he finished working with his thinking putty and making his super colossal squid. We just could not go on until that was done. And so we had to just wait and do that thing. Just that inflexibility, that difficulty in change. They have to eat the same things. They have to wear the same clothes, that kind of thing. Restricted interests. This can also turn into be a great thing. If they have a restricted interest, they become like little professors on that one thing. They become experts on it. And sensory. They just sometimes can be just hypersensitive to sound and touch and light and smell. Or they can be hyposensitive sensory seeking, where they chew on their shirt until, they're all slobbery, that kind of thing. Or touch everything. They have to touch every texture. They might come up to you and touch your jacket because it's an unusual thing. Or they might have excessive sniffing. Answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. And of course, all of these things are on a spectrum. A spectrum just means there's a very wide range of ways that impacts a person. So some people, those behaviors, even the repetitive behaviors, are as often as long as they're awake, they're participating in a repetitive behavior too, only when they're stressed. So there's like this huge range when we talk about spectrum.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people I used to work with, I really appreciated Asperger's, which used to define a particular part of the spectrum because it was usually higher functioning and they really understood themselves better with that particular terminology. I think now perhaps we're using neurodivergent as another word to describe not neuronormal, but perhaps kind of on a spectrum of all of these things you just described.
We had talked earlier before recording about how boys are more easily diagnosed than girls are. I wonder if you get to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Right. Girls tend to be more social, and they watch because they want to fit in. So they watch what's going on, and they kind of, especially the high functioning girls, are able to kind of navigate a little bit. They do still struggle with making friends and keeping friends. That's what's really hard for girls, even though they kind of have a little bit of that socialness. They're able usually to make some friends, but then because they are interested in only certain things, their friendship choices are limited because they have, that inability to be flexible to do other things. They might stand on the outside to watch games because they're not quite sure how to play them. And so they're missing out on that social opportunity to make friends in that situation. Boys just don't really care a whole lot. It's kind of how it goes. So it's really more obvious with them.
But there's a desire. That's particularly for the higher functioning. They want to fit in.
Yeah.
They want to fit in, but they just don't really, it's more of a, if you don't like me, that's your problem attitude in boys than girls.
And our eldest, who has been diagnosed on the autism spectrum, has said that social interactions are just so draining, and figuring them out and understanding cues are so incredibly draining that sometimes it's not worth it.
Right. And one of the girl in our family who has some of the same challenges, her terminology is I'm peopled out.
Yes.
I just, as you were describing some of the diagnostic characteristics, and I'm imagining all of our third culture kids that have a ton of transition, a ton of new things, lots of different sensory environments. What's been your experience working with TCKs and autism spectrum?
Right. Sometimes TCKs, especially the high functioning autistic ones, can hide in the fact that they're TCKs because they're just a little bit awkward anyway because they're going between cultures. But yeah, so sometimes being on the field is a good place for these high functioning autistics because there's a lot of times it's more accepting, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're in a community where it's not accepting, the behavior is not okay, and that's been a real problem. So I end up with families who are like, my kids can't function on the field, we have to go home to our passport country, and we have to get them in therapies and get them in a situation, and they've got a good group in the passport country, we need to stay there. And then some of our families are saying, oh no, being back in the passport country is terrible. They don't fit in at all. They can't make friends. So we need to stay on the field, but they don't have any resources on the field. And so it's really challenging. So that's been one of the biggest hurdles for our families, is for the child with autism to find friendships, and then for the families to find the support that they need for those kids. And where is that going to be? Where's the best fit for them?
And they may have other kids that have other needs too.
Absolutely. And then what's best for one child might not be best for the other. And that's a real challenge.
Yeah.
And because autism presents itself in such a wide spectrum with symptoms and ways, that the person interacts with the world around them, and families are all different and their field situations are different. Yeah, it can be complicated. And I wonder how you help families walk through the decision process of whether it's best to stay on the field or return back to their home countries.
Yes, in our pre-field, before the families go, we have a form that we have them fill out so that they can think through and be intentional about furloughs and where they're going to be. But as I come across families who have now a child diagnosed with autism, I almost bring that back out and say, okay, let's take a look at what is this child going to need moving forward, depending on where they are on the spectrum and what's happening with the rest of the family. And let's talk about being intentional on the next furlough. What do you need? And maybe you need to stay stateside or passport country. That doesn't usually go well.
Right.
I try really hard to make that gentle, but I am really wanting families and organizations to understand that even the high functioning autistic children are going to need their parents stateside. You can't take that child and drop them off in a university and walk away and go back to the field. You just cannot do that. It takes time for that child. Yes, they may eventually be independent of you, but that's going to take some time. And they have to learn how to do adult life things, and they need a person who really understands them there with them. They need their parents, they need their family around them. And that's a hard thing for me to have to say, but I need to say that. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity for families to hear that.
It's a lot of it's expectations. I think parents have desires to get back to doing whatever it is they feel called to do in the places they feel like they're supposed to do it. And for me, I think it's just, there needs to be a really big shift on what launching looks like. It's for the spectrum, young man, young woman, it's going to be a 6-7 year of growing into adulthood. And
exactly.
That might mean some school, that might mean a little bit of a job, and really, really, really slow transitions into those things, because transitions are really hard.
Transitions are really hard. And that's what missionaries do a lot of. And so when you have these families that transition from furlough back to the field, that child's going to have a reset, or they're going to regress in a lot of their abilities for probably 6 months or more, depending on the child. And so now they're just now catching up to, okay, now I'm on the field. Now it's furlough time again. And so this is back and forth, and it's really stressful for them. So that by the time they're ready to go off to college or whatever is after, they've been through a lot of that, and they have to deal with all of that stress too, in order to move off into the adult world.
What are some things you talk through with families if you have a family that's on the field and their child is like first diagnosed while they're on the field? You've talked about some of the things you've walked through, but there are other things that you haven't mentioned yet.
Right. If the child, sometimes you want to, depending on the severity of the autism, you may need to have your child, you may need to become the legal guardian of your child before the age of 18. And that's a court thing that you have to do so that you can help, so that you can be there to make decisions for them if they're not capable of doing that. You need to do that before 18, because after 18, it's impossible, nearly impossible to do if they're not capable of entering into adult contracts and things like that. Somebody needs to take that initiative. And also, if you have a child who it doesn't look like they're going to be independent of you, then you need to plan at least 10 years out, because that's the wait list now, of finding them places where that they will eventually live as adults, where that they can be independent of you, because you might not be around forever and they're going to need someone to care for them. So you need to plan for that.
This is really good stuff, Chyrl. Just I feel like you're such a wealth of really good information and help.
Thank you.
I'm also just thinking for parents who might have teens or even kids and they're wondering, ooh, maybe there's some neurodivergence here. How hard sometimes this might be sitting. It's a lot of change in expectations and hopes and dreams, a lot of losses that are sometimes hard to talk about because it's your kid.
Yes. We have another situation with another member of our family, and we were told this girl would not ever be independent. You plan on her living with you for the rest of her life. And I mean, this is a brilliant child, and we're like, she could be president if she wanted to, kind of child, and that was a real shock. We really had a hard time walking through the grief of that. And then finally, we just had to come back to the Lord and say, Lord, this is your child. You know her. We'll do whatever we need to do to help her thrive. By the way, she's independent. She lives in another state.
Wow.
She needs a lot of support from us from long distance. So we have conversation with her quite often, but she's able to navigate adulthood. And we're just so thankful to the Lord for that.
What do you find parents, families, kids struggle with the most in kind of understanding the diagnosis and navigating life? What are some of the things people really get stuck with?
I think what you just said, it's not, they've been called by God to do this mission thing. And then they have this child that doesn't fit that plan. And was my calling, was it my calling from God? How does this all work? I mean, and so, yeah, I think they have to go back to the Lord and say, well, what is this? And obviously the child has to come before the mission. That's the hard thing. And I have to say that.
Yes.
Families, the child has to come first. That was your first mission. God gave you this family. These children you're responsible to the Lord for them. And it has to come before the mission. And sometimes, so part of my story that I didn't finish was I wanted to go into missions, but I have these children. I'm not going to go into missions now. We had Wycliffe calling us for years before we were able to finally say yes. Our daughter had graduated high school. Our son was getting to the place where we could possibly go overseas. Then we come into Wycliffe and they're like, oh no, he's autistic. You can't take him overseas. I became an education consultant, which required me to get credentialing. So I got my master's in special ed, which led me to get my teaching credentials, which led us overseas to Thailand, where we took our son, and it was interesting to watch him navigate that. It was challenging for him, and we were in Thailand, and I was the special needs teacher for Grace International School, and we had planned to do the 1 year, but he seemed to be finally, 6 months in, he was starting to make friends, and he was living in a dorm. He was an adult, and he was at Payap University, so he was living in the dorm. It looked like it was going fine, and then it's time for me to sign another contract. And so I came home and we talked as a family, and I tried to pressure him and say, I really feel like I should stay here another year, and you're doing pretty well and you've got friends. And he's like, Mom, I can't get what I need here. I need to go back to the States. And I know what you do is very, very important, but I can't be independent without you. I'm not ready for that yet. And I'm more important.
Wow.
He's very self-aware and he's very understanding. And so I'm like, okay, that's the answer. And I had been praying up until that point, and I think God put that in his mouth. And that was enough for me to say, okay, we're going to go back. And then I get back, and it was not long after that Wycliffe was saying, can you do testing? And that led me to get my diagnostic certification. So it's just been a journey. And if I hadn't had the children I have, I wouldn't be a diagnostician today. I wouldn't have the special education training. So what I'm trying to tell families is, God knows your heart for missions. He also gave you these children, but that doesn't mean that he can't use both of those to help you spread the gospel. He's got something planned. There's always a plan. We just have to rely on the Lord.
There's always beauty in these situations, and sometimes it's a little bit harder in the moment to see it. I wonder, you mentioned at first when you were telling your story that at first Wycliffe was like, oh, you can't go because your son is autistic. And do you see, maybe with our sending organizations or others, a more rigid response to this? Or do you see organizations being flexible and giving families room to decide for themselves, like what's the best way forward?
I think there's a lot of flexibility, and a lot of times the organization doesn't know the child's autistic. With Alexander, it was we were at the training, and he was with us, and it was pretty obvious. So there, he's too inflexible. He wouldn't handle the change well. He was having a hard time just with the change of going to Florida.
There's been times I've been consulted as a counselor on specific locations. I think those need to be brought in. I don't know that they always are. Some locations just aren't a good fit. There's just not enough resources. And those resources are really, really broad, from speech and language pathology to, some sort of integration classroom, pretty big range. And a lot of places people go, they just don't have that. So
that's right. I've even talked to families who happen to have some OT or speech or whatever it is that your child needs in the city, where they now come from the smaller rural areas into the big city so that they can have those, but they're in another language. Yeah. So that's really not working well for the child. If the therapist doesn't speak English and the child is struggling to learn the other language, and the parents might not be as fluent. When you are learning a language, there's several levels of language, and medical terminology is not one of those things that you learn first.
Or second or third.
Or second or third. And I've had several conversations with families who's like, yes, we have a counselor and we have speech, but they don't speak the language and we're having a hard time communicating with them. I mean, they don't speak English and we don't speak the language well enough to understand them. So that's a real challenge.
What is language learning like for somebody on the spectrum?
Well, some of them can really learn language well and be really great, and some of them will really struggle. It just depends on the person.
Okay.
Usually autism is not by itself. They usually are comorbid with other things, often ADHD, sometimes dyslexia. And people with dyslexia struggle to learn other languages because they're still working on the English. So they eventually can learn another language. But it's going to be a lot more challenging because they have a problem in that area. The language center of the brain isn't as well developed.
Any other comorbid kinds of things? You mentioned ADHD,
Mhm. Yeah, learning disabilities.
dyslexia.
Yeah, dyslexia, all of those things. And Tourette's, we often see the tics. And some of that happens to, especially with kids who have autism and ADHD and they're on a stimulant medication, they'll have tics a lot of times. Seizure activity is often comorbid with autism.
Chyrl, I wonder what your thoughts are about teenagers with autism going to boarding school or boarding away from home. And I worked for a while at a school in Germany that had a boarding program.
Yeah.
And yeah, just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
I think that would be a real challenge for that person. Yeah.
I know you should.
How gently put.
I would not recommend it.
Okay.
They will have a real hard time with roommates. They will have a hard time with change. Fire drills in the middle of the night will just overload their senses. It's just, there's so many things that could just upset the apple cart. And being away from family, it's just probably not a good idea.
I'd love to shift a little bit. We've talked a lot about kind of families and kids, and I'd like to talk a little bit about adults and perhaps coworkers, colleagues, family members. What are ways that we can actually interact well with somebody that's on the spectrum, and how can we create community around them in a healthy way?
Right. One of the things is understanding that they're going to have a hard time initiating conversation. So beginning the conversation for them will be beneficial. Understanding that they're probably intelligent people is real helpful. Don't treat them like they don't know anything, because they might, whatever it is that they're trained in, they're probably experts in. The nice thing about people on the spectrum, what really is beneficial as an employee, is they're usually very punctual because they like schedule and they're very rigid at it. And they will follow the rules. They make good drivers. They follow the rules. Yeah, so they can be very loyal friends, but the friend needs to help with the friendship.
Presumably all those things you mentioned about following the rules and the schedules and the times and the deadlines would potentially be problematic if the world around them isn't operating that way.
Absolutely. Yes. So if you're constantly changing the schedule, they're going to be very upset.
You're thinking about a cultures where we lived, where a yes doesn't necessarily mean yes. They hardly say no to you. And going in and trying to understand those social cues, it's hard enough, I think, without the other things on top of it.
Right. And people on the spectrum are very rigid in the idea that if you say yes and you don't do what you say yes, even if it's a cultural thing to always want to please you and say yes, then you lied. That's just black. They're very black and white thinkers.
Yeah, a lot of times picking up on those social cues or subtle changes is hard. What about for like a manager who's managing somebody who might be on the spectrum?
Right. Again, giving them a job where it's structured, making sure that when you do the training, that you train them exactly the way you want them to learn it. Because if you teach them something that you didn't really mean to, they're going to do it that way until you have to retrain. Yeah, just helping them with a conflict resolution when things arise between employees, giving expectations ahead of time. This is what I expect from you. They're more likely to be really good employees, but you need to come in and check on them once in a while and say, how's it going? Is there anything you have to initiate those things? Is there anything you would like us to do differently for you? Because they're not going to come to you and say, hey, I really don't like the way I have to do XYZ. You need to be the one to say, hey, is there anything, about the job that would help you if we could do it differently?
Would that be, I guess, a fairly directive leadership style more than kind of laid off?
Mm-hmm. Right. Otherwise, they would probably need a job coach.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Chyrl, what are some common misconceptions that people have about others with autism?
Right. One of them is that only boys get autism, because about 4 times as many boys are diagnosed as girls. And I think it's because what we talked about earlier, girls are pretty subtle, and they often don't have the early speech problem that boys will have, because a lot of times they are pretty good at speaking right away. It's just the way that girls are created. Autistic people can be very intelligent. So just because they're not carrying on a conversation with you or looking you in the eye or interacting with you doesn't mean that they're dumb, or that they're not interested at all,
Or that they're being disrespectful.
or that they're being disrespectful. Right. So that's really important to understand. Because of movies that are out and television shows, not all people on the spectrum are, have a photographic memory or can do calculus when they're 10. There are some of those kind of people, music geniuses and such, but they're rare. Vaccines. There has been a lot of research over and over. I was one of those people who's like, well, when we took Alexander as a baby to Guam, we had to have a lot of vaccines. Could it have been the vaccines? But as I look back on it now, he was already showing signs from the beginning. And I've looked at the research, and there is really, what I have found is it doesn't show that it's vaccines. It's just not showing up there.
Would you recommend any of the kind of mainstream media that you're like, actually, does a pretty good job of helping people understand what it's like for somebody on the spectrum?
I was wondering that too. If there are TV shows or movies that just make you cringe, or others that you're like, ha, they get it better than others.
I liked the show Parenthood.
Oh yeah, that's right.
With the boy Max, I liked that. They did do ABA therapy, and now adult autistic people are saying, no, that causes post-traumatic stress when you become an adult.
Can you explain that real quick, what ABA therapy is?
Sure, it's therapy that tries to work with kids who have severe behavior issues, and they try to provide positive reinforcements for good behavior. But a lot of autistic people feel like it's trying to get autistic people to become neurotypical, right. And they feel really upset about it. Yeah. So, and then there are, according to people who are autistic, there are good organizations that support autism and bad organizations that support autism. And so that would be one to do a Google on. If autistic people feel like that, if an organization is supporting autistic people, then it should have autistic people at the lead part of that organization. It shouldn't just be neurotypicals. And so that's kind of where they're coming from.
I mean, I get that.
Yeah.
I mean, because you want people who understand you and get you, and not someone who's coming from the outside.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because we're guessing. We don't know that it hurts to look at somebody else in the eyes.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have known that, except that I was trying to teach him how to draw.
Yeah.
We're just going to practice eyes today. Oh no, he was crying. He was in upper elementary, and it hurts. Okay. I remember the other thing that I was going to say was about expectations for autisms are kind of missed. It's not just white people that are autistic. More white people have been diagnosed, but in the last few years, Asians, Blacks, and Hispanics have had better access to therapies and care. And so now, since 2018 through 2020, twice as many from those groups have been diagnosed than whites. And it's not because there are twice as many of them, it's just that they're kind of catching up. It kind of runs about the same through.
From what I read about it, it seemed like people from minority groups weren't necessarily diagnosed. They were just labeled as having bad behavior.
Yes.
Because a lot of the diagnostic criteria were developed on young white boys. So. Yeah. What are some of the unique gifts and perspectives that people with autism bring?
Yeah, that thinking outside the box is really great. And like I said earlier, they're very honest. Sometimes more honest than you really want. Don't say to your autistic child, how does this dress look on me? Because they're going to tell you exactly. If you don't want to know, don't ask, kind of thing. So they're very honest, very black and white. They follow rules. They're punctual. I mean, I'm using these as generic. Not everybody on the spectrum is going to be that way, but that whole black and white thinking, they just have a lot of, depending on the kid, they have different gifts, and they're usually stronger in some areas than others. just like everybody else in the world has strengths and weaknesses, but their strengths become their interest, and their restricted interest, they learn so much about it that they become expert in that thing.
Might even be linguistics. Who knows?
It could be very much linguistics or computers.
Oh, yeah. I found more adults discovering their own spectrumness when they're getting their kids diagnosed.
I hear that a lot. Yeah, I'll be sharing an evaluation. It doesn't really matter whether it's autism or any other thing. The adult is going to say, oh, you just described me. From the research right now, what they're saying is it runs in families. My son is adopted, and when he was older and we met the family, we found out that he has half siblings that are also on the spectrum. So, I mean, it does run in families. Kids who are born premature, like really early, have a higher tendency to be autistic. If you have a brother or a sibling, then you're more likely to be autistic. So the more children in the family, the greater percentage that the next child will also be autistic. Older parents, like 40s, tend to have higher rate of autistic children.
When you said that parents get aha moments whenever you go over the diagnosis, my husband and I have been reading a lot about autism. We give each other a lot of side eyes now. Like, oh, yeah, okay, I see that. I see what you're doing.
Exactly.
It's been great to have you on. I think this is a really helpful, relevant conversation for our listeners. Do you have any other resources or things you would like people to have access to?
One of the things that really helped our family was Temple Grandin's story, and she has a video out. And while she was much more extreme, it was in her autism and some of the symptoms she experienced. It explained, why the pressure, needing weighted blanket, why some of these things are the way they are. And just hearing it from her perspective helped my husband and I, and it helped our kids to say, oh, this is normal and I can become a doctor if I want to, kind of thing, And so I would recommend that as a starting place. And then there are quite a few books out on helping your child navigate social rules. That's really important, understanding social rules. And then there are some books out on comic strip conversation is by Chyrl somebody. Look that one up on Amazon. Just understanding how to be able to communicate with your child and help them draw pictures of what's going on, so you can help them understand how to communicate with people. Giving your children a script on how to introduce themselves and carry on that coffee table conversation. This is how you do this. Hello, my name is, I like such and such. What do you like to do in your spare time, kind of thing. Those are real helpful. And there are YouTube videos on teaching social skills that are really helpful.
Thank you for this, Chyrl. Well, I go back to what you said at the beginning, that all of us are made in the image of God. It is beautiful. And I think how beautiful it is to know someone with autism, to live with them and love them and see the uniqueness of God expressed in that way too. So I've enjoyed this conversation with you and enjoyed exploring it more.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right.
Have a great day, Chyrl.
See you next time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I felt that way our first few years. I feel like they're lying to us all the time. This is wrong.
Go to Papua New Guinea, be on a podcast. What more do you want?
But the spiders. Every time I think about Papua New Guinea, I think, don't go there.